This is going to be a very fun video to make. It wasn't that long ago when I uploaded a video criticizing PlayStation, and today I'm redirecting my bitterness towards Microsoft. You may have already heard about the leaked documents that reveal some pretty spicy information about upcoming projects, the design of their planned revision of the Xbox Series X, and their plans to potentially purchase Nintendo and even Steam. Now, these leaks were very fascinating to witness, not because of their actual plans. If anything, nothing that I saw surprised me in the slightest. Instead, what was interesting to witness was the reaction from the public. You see, the Xbox brand is very unique due to how it might be one of the few large brands that, despite being more powerful than its competitors, it's framed from the perspective of an underdog console competitor. Although in reality, Xbox is nothing more than a sector of Microsoft's long-term vision to amass control over the computer world, and one that's been failing for years largely due to their own missteps. But I would also say that the current state of Xbox is a reflection of an unpurged compulsion that Microsoft has had since inception that hasn't really changed but has indeed evolved into a different methodology. Ever since the release of MS-DOS, Microsoft has succeeded tremendously in establishing a presence in the computer market. What started off as a command line based operating system developed for x86 systems eventually evolved into becoming the baseline for the GUI based cultural phenomenon that is the operating system called Microsoft Windows. Now, as incredible and groundbreaking this OS was at the time, its success and dominance in the market wasn't exactly achieved naturally. You see, prior to this long-winded battle between Microsoft and the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission has been investigating Microsoft ever since the 1990s, and this was due to the fact that during this period of time, Microsoft had an uncontested dominance in the computer market, making it very difficult for competitors to participate in the market for two main reasons. The first is that the consumer base does not feel encouraged to purchase a PC that runs on a more obscure operating system that may not have as good of a supply of applications that can support. The second is that the software developers themselves may not want to dedicate time and resources into developing ports of their applications for an operating system that may not have enough people using it. So it becomes the chicken and the egg type of situation, but what was more damning about this was identifying some of the reasons that led to this predicament. One of the things that Microsoft was accused of doing was forcing ISV, aka independent software vendors, to sign very restricted non-disclosure agreements. Basically, how this would turn out was the following. Let's say Microsoft is about to launch a new operating system. During the development phase, Microsoft reaches out to other ISVs in order for them to have a closer look at how the operating system works, have to stress test it, and give feedback to Microsoft for any potential issues that may need to be ironed out, which would then benefit both parties once the new operating system comes out, as its launch will come pre-packed with ready-to-use and updated suite of applications. Now, during this process, because the OS is still in development, Microsoft will then force the ISVs to sign NDAs, which at this point, that makes sense. Due to the fact that they're publishing a closed-source proprietary operating system, they want to be protective of their code base against other competitors who would benefit from obtaining more information on how the OS works. However, what this also means is that since they can't make public any of their development plans while they're cooperating with Microsoft, they're not going to feel encouraged to develop software for competing operating systems, as well as not having time to dedicate their labor in porting their apps to other competitors, especially when the financial payoff isn't as big. Another way that Microsoft would push developers away from competitors was through the per processor licenses. Now, in case you don't know what a per processor license is, this tends to be more common in the server market. Basically, if a company wants to use Microsoft's Windows Server OS, or I guess back in the 80s and 90s this would apply to MS-DOS, they'll often pay for a per processor, or nowadays they tend to be per core license, in which Microsoft will provide copies of their OS based on the number of processors that the company wishes to ship their OS to. Now, what was particularly messed up about these licenses that Microsoft used to give was that it was claimed that the manufacturers were obligated to pay royalties to Microsoft even if they didn't intend to ship MS-DOS or Windows into every processor that they sold, resulting in many OEMs having to charge more for computers sold with a competing operating system, as they would still need to pay for the license for the operating system in question, while also paying royalty fees to Microsoft, which would result in higher costs. So their choice would be to either sell slightly more expensive computers running operating systems that aren't in high demand to begin with, or they could just sell less of those and more of Microsoft run computers. This resulted in Microsoft Windows amassing 90% of the PC market share during the 90s, overwhelming its competitors such as OS2 and even Apple OS. However, their reign in power didn't stop with the distribution of operating system. let's get back to talking about Apple. Now, during the 90s, Apple had developed something called QuickTime. Not to be confused with QuickTime Player, though you can tell by its name they're definitely related. QuickTime was essentially a multimedia architecture which allowed the playback, encoding, transcoding, and editing of multiple types of digital media, including video, audio, 3D graphics, etc. Now, what was interesting about QuickTime was that it wasn't an Apple exclusive thing. This was also available for Windows, and because of how effective it was, it posted a threat to Microsoft's own recently released multimedia API, namely DirectX. Out of sense of arrogance, instead of using this as an opportunity to improve their own API, Microsoft took on a more abusive approach. They instead proposed to Apple that they would be willing to assist in providing developer tools for writing multimedia, as well as assisting in marketing QuickTime by even going as far as to adopt MOV as the standard file type for media playback, unifying the QuickTime shell with DirectX as a single configuration for multimedia playback, and even showing the QuickTime logo when playing MOV files in Windows Media Player. However, as a result, they would need to be strictly collaborating with Microsoft in order to unify their multimedia solutions, and that Apple would not continue to take their independent road in releasing and marketing the QuickTime shell on Windows. If they were going to walk solo without collaborating with Microsoft, they needed to stop development for Windows. Otherwise, Microsoft would go out of their way to participate in the multimedia market with their DirectX API, use their power and influence to push developers writing media content to focus on them primarily over Apple, deliberately sabotaging compatibility with QuickTime, making it so multimedia content didn't run well on Apple's media players, and making it harder for Apple's tools to work on Windows. Apple wasn't the only victim of this. There was another company called Real Networks that specialized in developing APIs for web streaming audio and video content, which rivaled DirectX. As a countermeasure for feeling threatened by Real Networks, Microsoft took action in authorizing a $65 million budget for purchasing a rival multimedia streaming company called VXStream. Now, Real Networks eventually took notice of this, and feeling intimidated by the financial fortitude that Microsoft had, they arranged a deal to limit the scope of the development endeavors. However, if you think that Microsoft's bullying stopped and ended with its competitors, think again. Even with their partners, Microsoft did not shy away from intimidating them. You see, during the 90s, Intel was developing something called Native Signal Processing, or NSP. Now, if you want to have a more in-depth understanding of this, you're better off just reading it from Intel themselves. But just to give the briefest and most simplified dumbed down definition, it's a solution that Intel came up with at the time that allowed data to be processed and communicated on a software level instead of leveraging hardware level processing signals. It basically allowed them to not rely as much on DSP or digital signal processing, and instead some of that functionality is almost emulated in a way at a software level, which did result in some improvements in multimedia content. Now, at the time, Intel was keen on convincing developers and manufacturers to design programs and hardware equipment to take advantage of NSP, and it was believed that the drivers and APIs that were present on Windows operating systems weren't properly optimized for NSP, or just straight up did not use this technology at all. Now, this scared Microsoft for two main reasons. Firstly, remember when I mentioned earlier about Microsoft encouraging ISVs to dedicate their time in developing and optimizing their software for upcoming operating systems? Well, the more Intel lured in ISVs to dedicate their time with their innovative tech, the less time they had to babysit Microsoft until their driver support was able to properly utilize MSP, which would put them quite behind on the technological race, which was rapidly growing at the time. But most importantly, Intel did not make this technology exclusive to Microsoft Windows, meaning that if competing operating systems were able to properly utilize NSP, it would put Microsoft at a disadvantage in one area. Additionally, at the beginning, NSP only worked on Windows 3.1 and not in the soon-to-be released Windows 95, which would become Microsoft's flagship. And if they couldn't support NSP out of the box, it would make its release less appealing, especially if there are going to be other competing operating systems that could potentially support NSP, something that Intel intended to do in order to expand support for this tech and allow it to mature. However, much like QuickTime and Real Networks, instead of competing organically by innovating and improving their software, they resorted to intimidation tactics. This ended up leading to several complaints on the part of Microsoft, in which they expressed that NSP not being supported in Windows 95 would potentially cripple the sales of their new operating system, when they could gain access to this tech with the previous version of the OS, they accused Intel of being reckless with trying to release a better version of the software that could potentially result in unforeseen instabilities, and they even arranged a meeting with Intel for the sole purpose of demanding that they didn't release NSP to any operating systems, essentially holding back the advancement of the technology until Microsoft could get their grip and actually provide proper support for NSP. Now, I want you all to notice a pattern. Every time there are signs that Microsoft's falling behind on certain fields in the market, they don't counteract by being better than the competition. Instead, they use the wealth and influence to smother the competition. I really want you to keep this in mind because this personality trait is not a thing of the past, as I'm sure you'll start noticing the pattern with some of the modern day events. Now, in all likelihood, you may have heard of the drama between Internet Explorer and Netscape. Back in the late 20th century, the internet started to emerge and quickly grow in size, usage, and most importantly, potential. Now, one of the most popular web browsers during the 90s was Netscape Navigator, and the reason for why its rising popularity really scared Microsoft was that compared to other programs, web browsers are remarkably easier to port to different operating systems, and with the quick rise of popularity and standardization of the internet for your average computer usage, being able to run Netscape could significantly relieve the barrier of entry when switching to different operating systems. Microsoft was very much aware of the threat that Netscape posed, and as a result, they took very aggressive measures to make sure their browser competitor would fade into obscurity. Firstly, for the upcoming release of this browser to Windows 95, they plan to make it so browsers relied on the APIs that Microsoft provided, instead of Netscape's own set of APIs that were meant to be compatible with multiple operating systems. That way, web developers would inherently prefer writing code to primarily run on Windows, since it was the predominant operating system, and those web applications would now run appropriately when relying on the cross-platform APIs that other operating systems would rely on. Secondly, they intentionally withheld information about one of Windows' APIs for remote network access and essentially used it as ransom for them to establish what was described as a special relationship, in which I can only imagine would be one that favored Windows. Thirdly, they developed their own web browser, namely Internet Explorer, and made sure to aggressively push this into the market, doing things like bundling the web browsers when shipping the OS to computers and making it almost impossible to switch to default browser to Netscape. Not to mention, Microsoft would outright refuse to license their OS if they didn't come bundled with Internet Explorer, and many computers would actually have Internet Explorer installed on a separate partition, making it impossible for the program to be removed regularly through the control panel. Much like how they were willing to hold back development for NSP, Microsoft would have no qualms in making the experience for the end user worse by not allowing them to choose the browser that they wish to use by default, and the justification given in court was that removing Internet Explorer would cause instabilities with the operating system. But for the release of Internet Explorer 3 and 4, Microsoft finally made it possible to remove the program and control panel, and quickly people realized that removing this browser made no difference to the overall stability of the operating system. But as a result of Microsoft's aggressive campaign to bury Netscape into the ground, its popularity dwindled, and following this, the browser wars continued with other web browsers posing a threat to Internet Explorer. Not that that's particularly difficult to do given how terrible this browser was, but as far as Netscape's influence, it could never recover and eventually died out. There was a similar drama in which Microsoft was going out of the way to make sure Java-based web applications were difficult to port to other operating systems by relying on their own Java implementation instead of Sun's implementation. And by Sun, I'm referring to Sun Microsystem, who developed the Java language. And with their own Java implementation, they can be hard-tailored to favor Windows and harder to port to other OSs. They would also do things like encouraging developers to use their own Java implementation. At some point, they even blackmailed Intel by claiming that they would be willing to deny support for 3DX to AMD if Intel was willing to stop contributing to Sun's Java implementation. Now, there's a lot more I could bring up, like Microsoft's history of copyright abuse, demonization of the open source software, very questionable adware and harvesting of user data, but for the sake of keeping this video focused on the main subject of discussion, let's talk about Microsoft's involvement in the gaming market, particularly with consoles. Now, ever since the inception of the first generation of Xbox, compared to their close competitor PlayStation, Xbox has had a special relationship with the internet, in which they were ahead as far as integrating online features into their consoles, especially with the release of Xbox Live. During the original Xbox and 360, Microsoft generally maintained a fairly competitive and desirable ecosystem. minus the requirement for paying for a subscription fee in order to gain access to online features, including the mere action of playing online lobbies, although given how their competitors eventually resorted to doing the exact same thing, and this practice nowadays has become normalized, this isn't really something that's worth looking back up with that much ire. That is, of course, if we're only talking about the console side of things, because on the flip side, we have PC. Now, Windows has had a very strong presence in the realm of video gaming. Due to its much more open platform, PC gaming has had an appeal incomparable to console gaming that touches the feeling of development freedom. You have a more direct access to the game's files, which allow you to modify the titles and breathe room to a community of fan mods, as well as participating in independent projects that typically wouldn't take place in consoles due to the latter having stricter publishing rights. Although that's a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, the open platform gives its unique appeal, and many game studios will opt to release their games on PC due to the large demand. On the other hand, because it's a more open platform, game publishers have less control over what the community does to their games, which can not only lead to game fans applying patches and mods that enhance the experience of the game, maybe even more to the point where it might jeopardize the planned obsolescence that many game companies may consider practicing, but due to the easier access to game files, it also means that people can more easily share files around and encourage piracy, a concern that is less common on video game consoles due to the more locked down nature. Now, the Xbox brand, throughout the original and 360 generation, was growing tremendously, and they had successfully built a dedicated player base, which was a very impressive achievement given how Microsoft was competing against legacy gaming entities such as Nintendo that had been producing gaming systems for decades, Sony that developed the first gaming console more than half a decade prior, and a struggling Sega that, although never managed to stay relevant in the gaming console sphere during the 2000s and certainly the 2010s, they were still a legitimate competitor when the original Xbox first came out. Microsoft gained the opportunity to amass an unforeseeable control over the gaming industry, as much of video game development already took place in the PC platform due to the operating system being standardized on office and home computers, as well as many developers starting off their development career on PC through small indie projects as well as the modding scene. And it was through this that they came up with Games for Windows. Now, Games for Windows was Microsoft's solution to bridging the gap between Microsoft Windows and Xbox. Basically, PC games would get released with this certification, which would often be found on the cover of the case, similarly to how console games have PlayStation or Xbox brands in their covers. Now, the main benefit of Games for Windows was the fact that it shared online cross-platform with Xbox players, as well as having compatibility with Xbox peripherals. In fact, in some ways, Games for Windows shared a lot of resemblance with the current Xbox integration found in recent years ever since Windows 8. However, I'm just gonna say up front that what we currently have is much better than the disaster that was brought to us in 2006. Now, one of the first issues found with this Games for Windows service is that, much like with Xbox Live, Microsoft expected their users to pay money in order to play online, which amounted to a yearly fee of $50. Back then, and even until this day, this was unprecedented. While on the Xbox side of things, the concept of paying in order to play online was somewhat of an established standard, on PC, this did not fly, and Microsoft eventually had to walk back on this decision. However, in my opinion, this wasn't even the worst aspect of Games for Windows. I believe that its biggest sin was the fact that this was essentially just DRM. Using PC Gaming Wiki as a reference, if you bought a GFW game, you are likely to find one of these four types of DRM. One of them was server-side activation, which usually involved an activation key that you needed to insert in order to verify that you own the title, which would then be tied to your Microsoft account. This is fairly standard even for modern day digital purchases. In fact, one of the issues that you can run into with this method is that if you try to activate the key in a region that isn't supported, the key will just get lost and stop working. I can speak as a first-hand witness when I say that this is definitely something that still happens to this day. I won't specify which service I'm referring to, you know who you are. The other type of DRM used is referred to as legacy, which works similarly to the previous one mentioned, except this one doesn't permanently stay on your Microsoft account, though it does have a limit to how many times you can activate the key. Although I think the most egregious form of DRM that was present in GFW games was zero-day piracy protection, which was meant to prevent games that hadn't yet been officially released from running on your computer in the first place by encrypting the game files on the disk and doing an online check in order to verify the date. Now, to add some context regarding this, sometimes retailers will sell a game early to some consumers, usually if you have a close relationship with the store representatives or you're willing to pay maybe a couple of bucks extra. It happens on a few occasions, not even just with games, and whenever this happens, it essentially gives members in the cracking scene who have access to copies additional time to crack the game prior to the release date. Because at the end of the day, video games eventually do get cracked, but if you're able to keep your game protected during the first couple of weeks of its launch, that's already a positive because that's usually when sales reach their peak. So in order to prevent games from getting cracked during those initial days of the game's launch, Microsoft's solution was to simply prevent users from accessing the game prior to the release date. Now, the biggest problem with zero-day piracy protection is that it relies on online verification, and due to this, there are plenty of games today that are actually completely inaccessible because of the fact that the servers were shut down sometime around 2018 to 2020. So if you bought a game with this type of DRM, you essentially bought a product with an expiration date. Beyond the digital rights management, people have also reported a myriad of other problems such as save files getting corrupted, the launcher being broken, sign-in failures, and CD keys failing to work. So in terms of the PC scene, Microsoft during this period didn't have the best relationship with consumers, though likewise with developers. At some point in time, developers needed to pay in order to obtain the certification, but this eventually changed and became free of charge. Although I think the most interesting feedback came from Gabe Newell. Now, following the disastrous adoption of games for Windows, with the release of Windows 8, Microsoft came up with the idea of integrating the Xbox service and its brand into PC. A decision that, in my opinion at least, was actually pretty smart, but Gabe Newell had a different opinion on this. Apart from the fact that he described it as being such a train wreck that something had to be changed, which was probably right, but he's also commented that in his experience of working for Microsoft, they look at what they can accomplish when they limit the competitors' access to the platform, and at the time, the Microsoft Store was emerging, and it was something that they clearly wanted it to be part of the standard experience of installing apps on your computer. Gabe Newell's fear was that Microsoft would slowly try to drown out the Steam client, further integrate the Xbox service into the Microsoft Store, which they did, and at some point they would purposely make the experience on Steam less convenient than using the Microsoft Store in order to purchase game, which, based on their documented history highlighted in this video, wouldn't exactly be out of character for Microsoft. Because of this, Valve made the bold decision of investing in Linux and Apple gaming in order to become less dependent on the Windows ecosystem, with Linux eventually becoming the bread and butter for the hardware that they produce. Now, of course, Steam at this very moment is one of the most, if not the most popular client for gaming on PC, and their player base is largely using Windows, so I wouldn't exactly say that Gabe Newell's worst fears came into reality. But what he said is actually true, and I'll explain later in the video, but while the reputation on PC gaming was in recovery mode, things were still generally fine on the console side of things. Xbox 360 was a very successful gaming device, and a sign of good competition in the console scene. However, things took a turn for the worse for the upcoming generation, so much so that one could argue that till this day, they're still experiencing irreparable damage, all simply as a result of Microsoft showing perhaps a little bit too much of the true colors with the release of the Xbox One.
Backstage here at the Galen Center at the Xbox Media Briefing rehearsals with Don Matrick. Don, good to see you again.
Great to see you, Jeff.
So this is a big week for you guys, coming only 3 weeks after the Xbox reveal.
19 days.
Yes.
Who's counting?
Well, it was, it was a long 19 days for a lot of gamers having to wait for some game announcements. So tell me, coming out of that reveal, how did you feel about it? Because I know obviously a lot of gamers have been all over social media complaining. What was your takeaway from that? What did you learn from that?
Functionality of the box, some of the advantages that you get of having a box that is designed to use an online state. So that, to me, is a future-proof choice, and I think people could have arguably gone the other way if we didn't do it, and fortunately we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
The Xbox One reveal was quite possibly one of the most disastrous conferences ever hosted that I've ever seen from a big tech company. This was my first time watching this event, and the first thing that surprised me was how the first 15 minutes was spent talking about the console's capability as a home TV device, promoting the fact that you would switch between TV channels, open a browser, open Skype, and I was just wondering to myself, isn't this supposed to be a gaming console? Later on, I feel like Don Matrick finally remembered what the Xbox was originally for and started talking about things that actually matter. But then 40 minutes in, they started talking about television again. But you know, I wish this was the worst thing about the Xbox One reveal, but there was a much bigger and more concerning piece of information that was shared. You see, this system, had it launched with its intended vision, would have represented the death of any type of game ownership on the Xbox side of things. First of all, the console initially was designed to have a 24-hour internet check, meaning that your console could stay offline up to 24 hours, and after that, it would require you to connect to the internet in order to verify the integrity of the system and the applications. And if you connected to the same account in another device, you had only 1 hour before you needed to connect to the internet in order to verify the integrity. Oh, and by the way, this didn't just apply to digital games. If you notice this little line here, but you can still watch live TV and enjoy Blu-ray and DVD movies, you might be thinking, what about physical games? Do I also need to connect to the internet to play physical games? Yes, you had. And that's because at the time, Microsoft wanted to essentially kill off the concept of trading used games, as if you wanted to sell your copy of the game or just lend it to someone, you couldn't do that because once they verified that the copy of the game had been originally licensed to another user, you couldn't play the game unless the game publisher allowed their games to be sold in the secondhand stores, which even with that license to resell came with a cost. They had to pay a certain fee in order to do that, and look, even if brick and mortar businesses could afford to do that, the average Andy selling their games on a garage sale or through eBay couldn't really do that. Now, this did not bode well with the public. Xbox got a lot of flack for its decision from all corners of the gaming community, and they were forced to walk back on some of those decisions. The version of the Xbox One that we have currently is considerably better and more competitive with the PS4. Although with that said, there are still some aspects of its functionality that are still very much dependent on the internet. For example, during its initial setup, you need to activate the device using a Microsoft account or a gamer tag, which either way requires you to connect to the internet. After that, you don't always need to stay connected online, and you can mildly get away with staying offline unless you're playing games purchased from the online store, which although Microsoft claims that you can play them offline if you enable offline mode, the reliability of this feature is very questionable. There have been server outages in the past that caused people to not be able to access even their single player games, so I wouldn't rely on the offline mode feature. Not that I would ever expect them to let you get away with playing digitally purchased games indefinitely, which is why I always encourage people to buy physical games and not digital. But regardless, the Xbox One is capable of being used offline, but for that initial activation you still need the internet. Another area where choices can be found is with their backwards compatibility program. Now, when looking at the past couple of years, Xbox has generally been the champion of backwards compatibility when compared to the competition. But I think it's interesting to note that this wasn't always the case. Let's look at their closest competitor, PlayStation. The PS2 is backwards compatible with PS1 games. The PlayStation 3 is backwards compatible with the PS1 and initially the PS2, but eventually Sony started selling models that didn't include the chip to run PS2 games due to the fact that the MSRP for the PS3 at the time was more expensive than most people were willing to pay for. It could still technically play PlayStation 2 games, but only through software emulation, and it was exclusive to a select number of games that were a part of the PlayStation Classics program. Where Sony truly dropped the ball though was with the PlayStation 4, which simply had no backwards compatibility with any of their previous hardware. Now, if we were just talking about the PlayStation 3, that would somewhat be understandable because the PlayStation 3 had a very complex architecture, but the real blow came with the PS1 and 2, which had been relegated to their PlayStation Classics program, and much like before, it was limited to a select number of games that still wouldn't even work by inserting the original disc, and instead they were sold through the online store. Now of course, knowing the kinds of complex designs that old PlayStation consoles used to have, I'm able to somewhat understand why Sony didn't feel the need to invest in backwards compatibility when during the PlayStation 4 generation, they were more focused on trying to create a simpler and more recognizable processing architecture meant to facilitate the development process and allow these games to have better portability, which is why when it came to the PlayStation 5, It's casually backwards compatible with PS4 games without the need of software emulation, instead through partially manipulating the clock frequency. But while I look at all of this in hindsight with better understanding, when it's speaking from the perspective of someone with a huge catalog of classic PlayStation games, it's very disheartening when your latest and most powerful piece of hardware won't run your older games, especially when those same older games are only compatible for the hardware that they were designed, meaning that once they all break down, which eventually they will, how else will you be able to play your huge catalog? It was a bad move on Sony's part. And that's where Xbox mainly shined. Microsoft took the initiative and had the foresight to research backwards compatibility early into the production of their consoles, which allowed the Xbox One to have an advantage over the PlayStation 4 when it came to playing games from earlier generations. And it's an advantage that is still found even up until the Xbox Series X. Thanks to the advanced hypervisor technology, they're even able to run older games such as GTA 4 for the 360 at 60 frames per second, and even upscaled the first Red Dead Redemption to 4K. However, there was one issue with Xbox's backwards compatibility, and ironically, it's a similar issue as PlayStation Classics, which is the fact that it can't play the version of the game from the disc. Every time you insert an Xbox 360 disc into the Xbox One or Series X, you have to download a separate build of the game that is designed to run on the emulator that they have built into the console. While it's miles better than Sony's solution because A, it encompasses a large number of games, and B, if you have the original disc, it can still be used as a license to allow you to play the game in the first place. But it doesn't change the fact that you still need to download a copy of the same game, meaning that if something happens to the servers, whether they get shut down or you just simply don't have access to the internet, Xbox's flagship backwards compatibility becomes useless. But where I think this was especially bad was when it came to Xbox One games, because as far as the 360 and the original Xbox, those games I feel like are a bit more understandable why Microsoft would feel the need to download a modified copy of those games, because in the end, they were being emulated, and if downloading it from their servers means getting a patched copy that is properly optimized for the built-in emulator, that's somewhat understandable. But I feel like that's less excusable when it comes to Xbox One, which at some point in time, that was actually the case. If you tried installing Xbox One games on your Xbox Series X, especially the ones with smart delivery, they would just simply refuse to install on your console if you didn't connect to the internet in order to install an additional patch. Now, throughout the years, Xbox has experienced some network outages, and whenever it happened, it proved that despite the console having an offline mode feature that supposedly allow you to play games offline, when it came to digitally purchased games, they were not safe. Even if you are playing a single player game, if you purchase the title from the online store, even just simply accessing the game already downloading on your console can be compromised if there are any issues with the Xbox servers. And it's because of this that I'm glad that Microsoft, despite clearly intending to cripple the physical games market, they haven't cut off that source of distribution, which is great for people like me that doesn't want to be dependent on the internet, which is why it's very unfortunate that if you want to play older generation games that are supposedly backwards compatible with your latest console, I have to rely on the internet, and it's especially bad when even PlayStation allows you to play PlayStation 4 games on your PS5 without needing to download anything from their servers. If we're getting to the point where PlayStation has an advantage over Xbox in backwards compatibility, you know there's a problem. And I think that eventually Microsoft did realize that this was hurting their brand, and ever since last year, this online requirement has been taken away for quite a few of their older games. Unfortunately though, when it comes to their newer games, this may still prove to be a problem. Now when it comes to PlayStation and Xbox, they use Blu-ray discs in order to store the game data. Now Blu-rays can store a maximum of 128 gigabytes, specifically BDXL, which I'm not sure if that's what Xbox uses. Now depending on how large your game is, Blu-ray discs may not be enough to store the entire game, especially if you're using low capacity formats of Blu-ray. Now, this isn't a new issue. This used to happen even in previous generation of consoles, and the solution that they came up with at the time was to just simply bundle the game with multiple discs. Unfortunately, that's not what Microsoft does. Instead, if their games are too large, they will instead require you to download the remaining data off of their servers, which once again further makes you depend on the internet. This is just how Xbox is built on, even though they're certainly less aggressive with the online commitment compared to the original vision that they had for the Xbox One. But at the end of the day, these consoles at their core are designed to rely on the internet for a lot of its functionalities, and based on some of the leaked documents, it seems like their future vision may actually be worse than what they had originally envisioned for the Xbox One. In early 2020, or it might have been late 2021, it was revealed that Microsoft would be purchasing Activision Blizzard with a purchasing deal of $69 billion. Now, this news was very interesting to witness because it came out right around the time Activision was caught in a different set of controversies due to the allegations of work misconduct and sexual harassment. It was a trending topic for quite a bit of time, but once Microsoft announced they would be purchasing the company, suddenly everyone started talking about console wars. So yeah, it is certainly fascinating to witness just how easy it is to shift the discourse from a serious topic to consumerist drivel, but that's neither here nor there. Now, as I'm sure you are already aware, there have been attempts to stop this deal from different organizations, including the FTC, which already has a long history with Microsoft. Because of how drawn out these court hearings were and how widely publicized this was, I'm sure you're already tired of hearing about it, and to be honest, I'm not going to speak on behalf of whether or not this deal should have been completed or not, because the fact of the matter is, it has, and there's no walking back. What I mainly want to focus on are the leaked documents, which brings us back to the beginning of the video. So a couple of months ago, it was announced that the Xbox 360 store would shut down in 2024, which wasn't very good news, certainly not for me because I have fond memories of that storefront and era of Xbox, but it's not unsurprising. The fact of the matter is, despite the many arguments people have made for why producing physical media is more expensive and more harmful to the environment than hosting the game digitally, that doesn't mean that hosting a digital store is free of cost. It costs money to maintain servers, and there can indeed be environmental impact when engaging in cloud data storage, as it does require some natural resources such as water, electricity, heat, air, metals, and various such things in order to build their air conditioners, cell towers, cables, and to power the computers hosting the servers. And that's without even bringing up all of the issues of carbon emissions that come with these activities. So yeah, despite whatever propaganda you may have been told regarding digital versus physical, online digital stores are not endlessly sustainable. And beyond hosting the data, there's also the issue of having to renew licenses with the game publishers in order to continue having their titles available to be sold. At some point in time, these digital stores will no longer make financial sense to keep up, so they're either going to get delisted or shut down. Now, Phil Spencer, currently the CEO of Xbox Gaming, in response to the 360 store getting shut down, he made sure to assure to us that game preservation is still critical to them. It makes me then wonder why this can be their stance while they envision releasing an all-digital revision of the Xbox Series X. They even described it as a platform capable of leveraging the combined power of the client and the cloud. This right here shows that the always online ecosystem that they had back in 2013 has not changed despite them initially walking back on it. Now, of course, these arguments are from 2020, and since then, they could have easily changed their minds. But that doesn't change the fact that even as early as before the Xbox Series was even released to the public, they were already planning to abandon this altogether. Almost as if they've been waiting until the all-digital ecosystem became more widely adapted and accepted by consumers before they went all deep with this vision, which is scumbag behavior in my opinion. To me, it clearly shows that despite what Phil Spencer has stated, Xbox doesn't actually care about game preservation, because if they did, why would they plan to release a console that doesn't even allow you to purchase a game physically when we know that these stores will eventually get shut down? If I had a catalog of Xbox 360 games that are backwards compatible, how would I be able to play them with this self-described adorably all-digital console? It's bad enough that we need to connect to the internet, but to not even be able to play the game entirely because I dare to purchase the disc copy in order to physically own the game. I also find it very interesting that Phil Spencer described PC as being the best ecosystem for preservation, which I also do agree, but it's also ironic to hear that from him given how games purchased from the Microsoft Store or obtained through Xbox Game Pass have historically been the hardest game to preserve compared to other game clients.
The PC port of Forza Horizon 3 is plagued by a game-breaking bug that crashes to desktop upon reaching the loading screen. We initially suspected this had something to do with their DRM, as pirates reported the codex crack wouldn't work on Windows 10 builds released after the scene release. This made us wonder, is it the crack that's incompatible, or the older build that was cracked? If it was the older build that's incompatible, will the final legitimate build stop working after a future Windows 10 update? As the developer of both the DRM and the operating system, Microsoft has a unique ability to change Windows 10 in a manner that breaks the crack while also updating the legitimate game to work in the new environment. It would seem they did not patch the legitimate game to work in more recent builds, as we can confirm this bug also affects the demo downloaded off the Microsoft Store. In fact, we can't even get the demo to work on Windows 10 version 1903. The game just quits upon reaching the first menu. It doesn't even do us a courtesy of providing an error code or even an acknowledgement that it crashed. It just pretends like we pressed Alt F4. Given the fact that Microsoft took Forza Horizon 3 off the market, there is little chance the game will ever be fixed. In fact, it is likely that upcoming Windows 10 updates will break the game further to the point that even the few players that can get the game to work now might not be able to in the future.
In the past, when games were installed from the Xbox client, the game files were often encrypted and they were located in folders that the end user did not even have access to by default, nor were you even allowed to pick a custom folder location. Thankfully, this was changed later down the line, but there are still reports of some game files being difficult to edit due to insufficient permissions, which ends up making the process of cracking those games notably harder than any other game client. And if you can't circumvent DRM with PC games, then you're basically beholden to the gaming companies and have to rely on their own commitment to maintain the game's availability, something that time and time again has bitten us in the face. So when Phil Spencer chants about game preservation on their platform, he's completely bullshitting. If he really cared about preserving games, he would abandon the online requirement that has plagued the Xbox platform since the inception of the Xbox One. But he doesn't. The only thing they care about is keeping their users in their ecosystem, which to me shows exactly what are Xbox's main priorities. And funnily enough, it's not that different from what Microsoft has been doing for over 10 years at this point. Now, this right here that I'm showing right now is a chart highlighting Microsoft's earned revenue from the last year. Now, if you see clearly, it becomes very fucking obvious where Microsoft primarily earns their money from, and that is subscription services. And it's actually been like this for quite a while. One of the main reasons for why Microsoft doesn't make a huge deal about charging users to use their desktop operating system is because realistically, that's not how they earn most of their money. Microsoft Windows is by far the most popular desktop operating system, shipped in nearly every desktop and laptop computer out there being sold in the market. And yet, the money that they earn from consumers and OEMs paying for their license is almost half of what they earn from Microsoft Office, which for many years has largely adapted a subscription-based model. And of course, where Microsoft mainly stacks their cash from is in the server scene. There is even a recent rumor floating around that Microsoft 12 licenses will be subscriptions based on a few reports of references to subscription edition, subscription type, and subscription status in one of the preview builds. From what I understand, this was eventually debunked and Microsoft confirmed that this wouldn't happen, but when I initially heard this news, it felt genuine because it's pretty much been Microsoft's business model for the past couple of years, which brings us back to Xbox. Back in 2017, Microsoft introduced the Xbox Game Pass, a subscription service that provides a decent amount of games available for an indefinite amount of time, as long as you continue to pay for them monthly or yearly. Now, I actually like Game Pass. Not so much as something that has much value to me, I don't pay for it personally, but a service that I believe is a good response to the common concern that some gamers can have, which has to do with the price of video games. If you're someone who's not in a financial position to regularly purchase games which can cost up to $70, you can instead pay $10 a month and get a wide variety of games, including some first-party games that become available day one. It's a compelling deal from the perspective of the consumer. It's been Xbox's bread and butter. This is the breakthrough subscription-based service that Microsoft is banking on in order to expand their revenue and influence in the gaming sphere. So much so that they've made it available in other platforms including Android, iOS, macOS, and on Chromebooks. And it's able to achieve this because Xbox Game Pass is also a cloud service, an area that Microsoft has done a great amount of research and investment on, meaning that even if your computer isn't compatible with the vast majority of games, you'll be able to play them through the cloud. And I believe that ultimately, this is the main reason for why Microsoft ended up purchasing Activision Blizzard. Something very interesting that I've been seeing regarding the discourse of the Activision deal is whether or not this might be the saving grace for Xbox to finally compete with PlayStation as far as game exclusivity. But the thing is, I actually don't think Microsoft's real goal here is to directly compete with PlayStation, which is probably the one aspect of all of this that I do believe is probably going to disappoint a lot of people, because I think many seem to be under the impression that in the coming years, Activision games, Call of Duty often being the center of the discussion, will have a turnaround and receive special polish as part of Xbox's lineup of first-party games. But I really don't think that's gonna happen. Aside from the fact that Xbox in general doesn't have the best track record when it comes to their first-party games, even Phil Spencer himself has stated that making good games isn't what's going to allow them to compete in the console scene.
Our vision is that everybody who's on console has to feel like they have a great experience and they're a first-class citizen. They've invested a ton in our platform. But we are not in a position, and I see it out there, I see commentary that if you just build great games, everything would turn around. It's just not true that if we go off and build great games, all of a sudden you're going to see console share shift in some dramatic way.
Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that I think them purchasing Activision Blizzard can't disrupt the console market. In fact, there are emails out there from Matt Booty where he stated that they wanted to spend Sony out of business by way of investing billions of dollars in acquisitions, but I don't think their goal is necessarily to pitch their Xbox console by way of offering high-class first-party games the same way Sony and Nintendo does with their game devices. If anything, Microsoft is more than happy to allow their services in other platforms for as long as they're able to be the dominant player in the market, which I believe is their real objective. At this point, Xbox isn't really a console brand anymore, it's a multi-platform gaming service. They want it to be the next Microsoft Office 365 for gaming. Something that I do believe they can somewhat achieve, especially because by comparison, there aren't that many companies out there that have done heavy investment in cloud as much as Microsoft. At this point in time, the only two companies that I can envision competing in this department are Nvidia and Amazon. Not to say that there aren't other companies that do cloud gaming, but I don't think any of them are as big as Microsoft. Amazon and Nvidia are the only ones that I feel like have enough money and experience in cloud and AI research that I can realistically expect some degree of competition in cloud gaming, but even then, neither of them have the same degree of first-party titles as Xbox does in order to pitch their services to the public as their flagship. Now, of course, since we're talking about cloud gaming of all things, do take this with a grain of salt. The gaming community hasn't exactly been the most accepting of the concept of playing games via cloud, so this vision that Microsoft has of turning Xbox into the Netflix of gaming is in a bit of a rough spot. It could turn out to be the greatest investment that they've made, which will pay off 5, 10, 15 years from now if cloud gaming ever becomes normalized, but at the same time, this could all turn out to be a huge money sink, especially if the leaked documents are believed to be true, which shows that Microsoft expects the number of Game Pass users to surpass 100 million by 2030, and if not, they would exit the gaming business altogether. Now, maybe this is just me underestimating the brand power of Game Pass. At the end of the day, it's Microsoft. Maybe they'll up their advertising game and manage to get those numbers by 2030, but as it stands, the only way I can envision them reaching that number would be if they bought another publisher on top of Activision Blizzard, which a part of me does believe they might do, but who knows. Maybe that chart was intentionally overblown in order to convince the judge to allow the Activision deal to continue, but to be honest, I actually don't think those numbers are based on fake expectations. I actually do believe Microsoft intends to reach those numbers, and that's because despite the statements made in the past regarding the sustainability of Xbox Game Pass, this year Microsoft admitted that putting games on Game Pass absolutely cannibalizes sales. Now, of course, a lot of it can depend on the scale of the game. If you're an indie developer, maybe the licensing fee that Microsoft offers to you is so high that it allows you to recoup some of the losses during the production and is a safer guarantee of making your money back compared to the game profiting on its own through game sales, which could be a bigger gamble to make when you don't have enough advertising power. So for indie games, it might not cannibalize that heavily, but games with higher notoriety will definitely lose money if they make their title available on Game Pass day one, which Sony has historically refused to do with their first party releases. And although this does upset people, if I'm being completely honest, they're probably doing the right decision from a business viewpoint. What Xbox is doing right now is a huge gamble, as they often make their first party games available on Game Pass day one, which ends up cannibalizing their own sales. For this to be a sustainable business model, they need to have a high enough number of users, otherwise I imagine that they're just going to routinely operate at a loss. Although one thing I'm interested in seeing is what effect this will have on the mobile scene. Historically, Microsoft hasn't exactly done a very good job in the mobile market, but now that they own Blizzard and King, they have a large variety of mobile games, and I imagine they will use this to their advantage in order to have a larger influence in the gaming scene. Although my biggest concern with the purchase of Activision Blizzard is actually on the PC side of things. Now historically, Microsoft has been fairly cooperative with cross-platform releases. Typically, their first-party games will release simultaneously on Steam and on their Microsoft Store. But that's not the case with every publisher, and interestingly, one of them is Blizzard. For example, when it came to the release of Overwatch 2 and Diablo 4, they were released on Steam months after they were made available on Battle.net. And a part of me does wonder if one of the ways they intend to increase Game Pass users is by doing more premium launches in which their games will get released on Steam and other third-party platforms days, weeks, or months after their release date. Although frankly speaking, that's not even my biggest concern. One of the main concerns is a potential future in which Microsoft may choose to unify their multitude of publishers into one centralized brand. While I don't believe that they will abandon their Bethesda or Activision Blizzard brands, I just don't think that's very likely. It wouldn't surprise me though if they find a way to attach the Xbox or Microsoft brand, which can be in multitude of ways, and one way that I certainly fear the most is with their API. For example, if we ever got to the point where Activision and Blizzard games started being tied to Microsoft or Xbox servers, which would then be a problem for two main reasons. For one, this would put PlayStation and Nintendo in an awkward position where they would essentially have to allow their competitors' brand to be plastered on the platforms, but where I think this would mainly pose an issue is on Linux gaming. Now, very recently, a new entry in the Forza series, namely Forza Motorsport, came out plagued with a myriad of issues. One of them is during the actual installation process. If you try to play this on any Linux build, the game will simply not launch because it tries downloading some Xbox services from Microsoft Store, which Linux obviously has no access to, so the game becomes completely unusable. One may argue that Linux isn't a supported platform to begin with, but I would argue that if we're going to bring up competition in the console scene when talking about the Activision deal, I think it's just as fair to talk about competition on the PC side of things as well, as right here represents exactly what Gabe Newell was talking about back in 2012, in which Microsoft loves to limit the competitors' access to the platform. They know that there is a large number of consumers who own a Steam Deck powered by Linux, and their previous Forza games did not have this issue. Now granted, they're far from perfect as far as how playable they are, but we never got to a point where Forza requires you to connect to Microsoft Store in order to download Xbox services. This wasn't a critical requirement that you couldn't figure out a workaround to. This was very much a deliberate decision to increase the dependency to their platform, which is incredibly anti-consumer. Oh, and by the way, finally a reminder that Motorsport is a racing game with licensed cars, meaning that years from now, and I mean very few years from now, this game is going to get delisted once Microsoft is unable or unwilling to renew the license for those cars, which happens with every Forza game. And yet, the physical copy does not have the full game on the disc. Launching the game, even on the Steam client, involves connecting to the Microsoft Store, so who knows if their server calls will still be active once the game gets delisted. And the final nail in the coffin, it's online only. So once the servers get shut down, which eventually they will, I really hope you enjoy playing a stripped down free play. So yeah, if you purchase Forza Motorsport, you pretty much bought a game with an expiration date. And then Phil Spencer wants to say that they care about game preservation.
I see a lot of pundits out there that kind of want to go back to the time where we all had cartridges and discs.
At the beginning of the video, I listed off the history of Microsoft engaging in anti-competitive practices, and the reason for why I chose to do this is because I don't understand why, but I feel like Xbox has gained this undeserved reputation of being gamer-friendly, and I wanted to remind everyone who exactly is the company behind the supposed gamer-friendly brand, and how even after decades have passed, not much has really changed since then. If you read some of the leaked emails, it shows that Microsoft has slowly been buying shares and stocks from Nintendo as a sneaky way to gain further influence in the company and push for a collaboration between both companies. This is not a company that is in favor of a healthy competitive market. Since their inception, their only goal is to establish a monopoly, and despite their attempts in escaping eyes from government agencies, their true colors still leak out. Not so long ago, Microsoft decided to base Microsoft Edge off of the open source Chromium engine, a move that gave off the impression that the company was finally embracing the open browser ecosystem after a long history of trying to monopolize the browser space with Internet Explorer. And yet, with the release of Windows 11, the browser has now become more difficult to remove as the default browser. It requires third-party scripts in order to remove it entirely from the computer, and there have even been reports of people failing to launch Forza Motorsport after uninstalling Microsoft Edge due to some dependencies with WebView 2 runtime. Xbox, by virtue of being owned by Microsoft, is not a friend of consumers, though it is a very great platform. And for many years, I've been fascinated with its presence in the console gaming sphere. In a lot of ways, Xbox has even influenced its competitors. They were one of the first to embrace a dedicated online service with Xbox Live, and then Sony followed that up with the PlayStation Network. They started off the trend of paid subscription service in order to unlock online features and extra benefits such as free games per month. Then Sony followed that up with PlayStation Plus. I personally don't own an Xbox console because it is of my belief that these consoles are way too reliant on an internet connection, which to me diminishes the value of owning one, but I certainly do enjoy following its direction, and I would say that in the coming years, Microsoft has the potential to either cripple the Xbox brand forever or establish a new standard in gaming. But regardless of what it might be, they are certainly a threat to consumer ownership, and it's a subject that I feel like not enough people are invested in. Xbox Game Pass is a good service, but it is the antithesis of game preservation, and if this is what Microsoft wants to push to consumers as the new standard of gaming, we're going to slowly lose the ability to obtain ownership of our games. In a way, Microsoft finally succeeded with their goal from 10 years ago. They wanted to kill off the resale market, and I think they finally will with this new direction that they're heading towards, except this time, no one will bat an eye. Back then, everyone from all sides of the console war united together to blast Microsoft for this incredibly anti-consumer move. But nowadays, people don't care, and I think that's what mainly worries me. Microsoft isn't even the only one doing this anymore. Sony now requires their users to connect to the internet in order to verify the disk drive. They haven't gone full Xbox mode, but they're getting there. The future of console gaming seems pretty grim to me, and at the end of the day, the most I can do is just to complain on YouTube. But until then, all I can really do is just mope. And that's all I have to say. Take care.